Elizabeth Warren is here. She is a professor at Harvard Law School and an expert on credit and bankruptcy. Last fall, she was appointed by the Senate to head up a committee to oversee the government's bank bailout program known as TARP. Their latest report has just been issued. It looks at TARP's impact on small businesses and families, as well as many other things. I am pleased to have her here at this table for the first time. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start with the TARP program. What do you think of the stress test?
Well, I think the stress test has kind of put all the chips on the table for the Treasury Department. This could be a real turning point for them. Let's remember where we started this last October. Secretary Paulson said, in effect, give me $350 billion to the banks, no strings attached, go, take, do with it what you want. Congressional Oversight Panel comes pounding back and says, a little transparency here, a little accountability, and we need a real plan that really works. So there have been changes. We're now at what I kind of think of as Treasury 2. Secretary Geithner is now Secretary of the Treasury. And we've seen some movement. There's clearly more transparency in the system. They've kind of tried to handle multiple things, mortgage foreclosures. But we keep pushing for more. And so now they really have given us a lot more transparency. They've said a lot more about, here's how it is, here's what the economic circumstances look like for these financial institutions. This is a moment when Treasury can demand more accountability from these
If
banks.
you get our money, we want more accountability. We
That's
want to know
right.
how you spend every dollar. We want to know what you plan to do with it, and we want to know how you want to avoid the kinds of mistakes that brought you here.
They can. That's exactly right. And they can make some hard decisions and clarifying decisions about what Treasury's overall plan is here. Are we going to keep feeding the banks? Are we going to what are we going to do with them? So I see this as a moment when Treasury's kind of got it all pushed out here on the table, and what they do with this stress test is really going to define sort of the next turn.
It's a defining moment because it's transparent and we see much more than we've ever seen before.
That's right. The whole world has changed with this money from TARP in the following sense. Banks, especially the big ones, they talk to each other. They live in a tight, narrow little world of they talk to each other, and occasionally they talk to their regulators. But all of that occurs way off stage for the rest of us. They don't talk with the rest of us. But
the rest of us are the people they lend money to and their stockholders?
That's right. By and large, they have a very quiet, very private, very profitable conversation. And what's changed is they've now had to take hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money in order to stay afloat. And I think that's fundamentally changed the conversation. In my view, at least, it means the American family now has a seat at the table. We get to hear it, we get to participate in it, we get to talk about what the right decisions are.
How do we get to participate?
Well, the way I think is it partly starts with this very conversation. We participate when the newspapers talk about, here's what we've learned. Here are the banks that are in trouble. Here are the banks that are not in trouble. Here's Treasury's plan. I think a big part of the responsibility of the Congressional Oversight Panel has been to reach out and try to talk about what Treasury is doing, to ask for more from Treasury, but to take that and talk with American families about it. I see it this way. If only the same tight little group talks to each other, what comes out of this is not only that we spend money to help them get past this crisis, but most importantly, what's going to come out is we're going to write a set of rules going forward that are going to define what our economic world looks like probably for about the next 50 years. So I want one where families have a seat at the table. And when we talk about regulation, when we talk about change, we're looking at it for the whole economy.
But do families have a seat at the table because Congress has a voice, or do they have a seat at the table because what?
Well, they have a seat at the table in part because it's their money, and ultimately they will hold their elected representatives responsible. And I think the American people are very alert now to this problem. And they're alert not only because their jobs are at stake, they're alert not only because it's their homes that are going down in value or that they're actually losing. They're very alert to it because it's their tax dollars that are keeping these banks alive.
Time after time, Secretary of the Treasury after Secretary of the Treasury, economic advisor after economic advisor come to sit where you are, and they say the following, which you have heard 1,000 times. We had to do this to save the system. We had to do this or the consequences would be much worse. We had to spend this amount of taxpayer money because otherwise it would have been much worse for the taxpayer.
So for the first time, when Secretary Paulson went to Congress and said, I need $700 billion to be able to try to save the economic system, Congress did something different. It gave enormous flexibility, said you've got a lot of discretion, you can do this in the ways you think are best, but we're going to set up a group, and they're going to be on the outside, and they're going to review what you do, they're going to talk about it, they're going to talk about your process, they're going to talk about your decisions, they're going to stay on the outside, and they're going to give us a report every 30 days. Not for a month, not for 3 months, but for more than a year and a half. As long as you've got this money, we're at least going to have an outside group that's going to have an outside voice that's going to stay after you, and going to stay after you ultimately on behalf of the American people.
You belong to that group.
That's the structure.
Have you had impact?
Oh, I think so.
Here's what I really want to get at, because I think central to what I understand that you have written and said is 2 points. There may be many more, but I understand at least 2.
Okay.
One is that you're not so impressed with the kind of planning that they have done in terms of how they're going to spend this money, how it's going to be accounted for, and how transparent it's going to be, and what the standards are. Okay? That's number one, I understand from you. Number 2, I hear from you, these people come somewhere from the same place, and they're cut out of the same cloth, and they think alike, and that's not all that good.
So you need to remember,
Yes.
my job is to stand on the outside and to keep pushing them. My job is not to hug them or kiss them or anything else. My job is to say, here are places I think you could change for the better, and I think these are important. So we push over and over and over. More transparency.
Okay.
More accountability.
That's process.
No, it is not
That's
process. It is content as well. And that's my job. I stand on the outside. And as they move, we move. And as they move, we move more. So we're moving. This is a process. This is better. There's better content here than there was before. Come on. Secretary Paulson, how many...
I'm not defending anything.
No.
Tell me, come on.
But Secretary Paulson, how many dollars did he put in to mortgage foreclosures, right? Part of the statute says that this is an important part of what we're trying to do with this money.
So they did not start to modify...
Not a dollar.
Until we had a new administration.
That's exactly right. And remember...
Why didn't they do that? They didn't believe that the foreclosure was at the source of the problem, even though we've had their lead person here say it was not so much foreclosure, it was the problem was that the housing crisis had to do with the housing prices.
But this goes back to the whole notion of worldview.
Right.
If your worldview is that it's all about that handful of banks on Mount Olympus, then you have a different notion of what the problem is, and you have a different notion of what the solution is. If your worldview is about 117 million American families, households, and you understand the kinds of pressures they're under and the problems facing them, you have a very different vision of where we need to concentrate our resources and where we need to start solving the problem.
So you want them to say to these banks the following: we're going to give you some money. We call this TARP money. It's taxpayers' money. And we want your view not to be how you can take that money and benefit your stockholders and benefit the bank. We want you to take that money and figure out how you can make this bank work for us, because we believe banking is responsible for the flow of credit and money through the system, which is essential to our economic lifeblood. Without it, we die.
Yes. We have to have banks. We can't barter pigs for haircuts. I get that. We can't run this economy without it.
Well,
but ultimately...
Pig will get you a lot of haircuts.
That's right. That's right. I don't need a lot of haircuts at once.
Yes.
But ultimately, that's really the name of the game. The banks are there to serve the rest of us. We are not there to serve the banks.
And that's what happened. They were only thinking about serving themselves. They've had no public spirit, no public masking.
I think they have been there to serve themselves, their shareholders. That's been what it's been about for the financial institutions.
So just nationalize them then.
I don't know that ultimately serves the rest of us.
Don't know, or am sure it doesn't serve the purpose?
I think it depends on exactly where the problem is. Look, there are a lot of different ways to deal with a financial meltdown. We've had a lot of experiences. You know, we had the savings and loan crisis. We closed 700 banks during the late 1980s and early 1990s. So there are options on the table. There's liquidation. Yeah. There's reorganization.
But there was property at the end of those security documents.
And there's subsidization. Right. And in our April report, we talked about all the tools in the toolbox. It's important to keep those in mind.
The point is that you know, there are all these basic ideas and people come at them from different places. Like the question of what is, in fact, we ask ourselves, what's the function of a bank? Right. To make money for its stockholders, or to provide capital and funds for the system?
Look,
and benefit Americans.
They get government guarantees. They get FDIC insurance. Right. They're getting support from the taxpayers right now. But they get a lot of things that let them operate. They get the right to operate as a monopoly, right? They can only work with bank charters. They get all of those things from the public because they are there ultimately to serve the public. And that's the critical point. But you know where this really goes? We're talking right now, and rightly so, about how we're going to pull this economy out of the ditch. But the real question is that we're going to write a set of rules going forward. We're going to write a set of rules that are going to make a difference for this country for 50 years.
Tell me what you would like to see in those rules.
I'd like us to start with the American family. We now have a market that doesn't work. And it's not the market about big banks. It's the market right down at the household level. Can you read your credit card agreement?
No.
I can't either, and I teach contract law as well. It's more than 30 pages long.
Yes.
It's got tricks and traps and terms. I read my own pricing agreement, and after 47 lines, the last 2 lines say, notwithstanding the foregoing, we reserve the right to charge any amount at any time for any reason. This is a market that doesn't work. This is a market where profits are increased if banks put more tricks and more traps on mortgages, on credit cards, on student loans, all kinds of things that are going on here. Remember how this crisis got started. We ended up letting these financial institutions sell these incredibly risky products to Americans who didn't get it, didn't understand exactly how much this mortgage was going to cost, didn't understand what kind of risks they'd taken on with this credit card.
Well, but before you, there's one little bit of a but there,
yeah.
and I hear you and I'm on your side. It is this notion that, there were some people that knew that they did not have an income stream that
no doubt about it.
That enabled them to buy a $700,000 house.
No doubt about it. There are people who've misbehaved all over this system.
Right.
But let's be clear. There is no one who is helped by a 31-page credit card document
except
you
people
can't
who
understand
write the document.
except the people who write the document. They're the ones who profit.
Yeah.
Same thing on 400 pages of
And your point is you're
mortgages.
fixing the game. When you write it, nobody else reads it.
That's exactly right. And so what happened is we took those very risky instruments. We have a market that's broken. We built it into the system. We did asset securitization. We moved it up the system. We moved it up the system. We sold it and sliced it and diced it. And it ended up in my 401k. It ended up in municipalities who thought they were buying something safe. It ended up, for goodness sakes, in China and in Sweden, right? We destabilized an entire American system and worldwide economic system one family at a time. We started it right down at the basic level. So when we're going to talk about regulatory reform, in the 1930s, we started it by making it safe to put money in banks. We need to start regulatory reform in 2009, right down at the family level, to just get a market for credit that works for families. You don't have to protect
Okay, but I love the objective.
Mm-hmm.
How do we do that?
We know how to do this. How did we make water safe? How did we make the paper not have arsenic in it, and your suit have be properly labeled for what it had? This is what government actually does. It supports markets by creating agencies that say, hey, you just have to be, you have to disclose, right? You got to have some minimum safety standards. We've done this over and over. We've done it with food labeling. We've made sure that little babies' car seats don't collapse on impact, that we don't have lead in children's toys. We ultimately have a baseline safety for every product you taste, touch, smell, feel, but we don't have it for credit products.
Okay, if you were going to put together a committee to recommend to the President of the United States, Chairman of the Fed, what the regulations for the future, which will shape the next 50 years, are going to be. Who should do this? It ought to be in the full light of air.
Right. So I would say, let's ask Congress to give us a new agency, right? We've got to have one more thing in government. We've taken care of the safety, we've taken care of our environment, we've taken care of food and drugs, we've taken care of basic consumer products that you buy and sell, meat, agricultural products. Let's do one for credit products. Basic safety so that the markets can work. Ultimately, I'm a real free market girl. I mean, I truly believe markets bring us enormous riches. They let us do lots of things, including they let us be stupid. And
why are you pointing at me?
No. And we should hold people responsible for being stupid. What we shouldn't do are have markets that are designed around tricking people. We have to come back to the notion that government really has a function in America. It has the function of creating kind of these basic safety. Think about how the world, how well markets have worked. My favorite example is toasters. You know, there were two ways you could have gone in the toaster market. If we'd had no safety standards, there'd be a way to make profits. Take out the insulation, because that insulation costs money, right? Use the cheaper wiring, and if 1 in every 5 toasters bursts into flames, too bad. If customers can't tell the difference, you'll make nice profits.
And yeah, we got a free market system. They should have bought a more expensive toaster.
That's exactly right. That's right. But no, we said we're going to have some basic safety stuff and do your competition for toasters. But how do we compete in the toaster market? Boy, we compete on color and design and price and, toasters that also play Battle Hymn of the Republic or whatever it is. But it's a market that works because nobody's competing by tricking people.
And we don't have that kind of market in the financial sector.
That's exactly right. And in the financial sector, you got to remember, we're talking about mortgages and credit cards. We're talking about people's entire economic lives that can be swept away by a hidden clause in the back of a long contract.
You have spoken of your eloquent belief in the free market system, but the role of government representing the people to set standards. I mean, how are we going to get there?
Okay, so I think you asked exactly the right question, but I want to say it this way. There is nothing about putting together a government agency that does basic standards, safety standards, that's rocket science. All it takes is the will. And so this is what leadership is about. Our president, our Congress, This is our government we ask for. There are no lobbyists on behalf of ordinary American families.
That's been our problem, hasn't it?
It has been our problem because there are a lot of lobbyists who have profited from a market that doesn't work. So that's our question, isn't it? This is the moment in history. This is why the decisions we're going to make coming out of this, everyone is focused on, how are we going to get the bus out of the ditch? And I know this is terribly important.
That's what the president says.
That's right. The real question is the going forward. Are we going to take the path that says basically same rules? What we're going to do is we're going to keep up this boom and bust cycle, no real regulation, we bail them out when we have to, or are we going to take a different path?
Define the way the American economy will work and how much government is involved.
Mm-hmm. And the way in which it's involved. It's the way in which it's involved. Secretary Geithner talked about systemic risk regulation. He's talking a lot about at the back end, once you've fed a lot of risk into the system. And that's important. But remember, if you do better at the front end, if you do better with families, you need less regulation going forward. If we can make these markets work again, this is not about the heavy hand of government, it's about the smart hand. It's about a lighter hand, but a smarter hand. That's what we're looking for. It's a moment for us as a country. This is the decision we're going to make.
You think we'll rise to the occasion?
Oh, God, I hope so.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you on this program.
Good to be here.
Elizabeth Warren, Harvard law professor, has become one of the voices that is being listened to more and more in Washington and in the media. Back in a moment. Stay with us.